The sharp, cracking sound of a salute echoed in the stunned silence of the first-class lounge, a gesture of deference so profound it seemed to suck the very air from the room. For the two officers who still had their hands on Ambassador Renee Collins, their faces were a mask of disbelief and dawning horror. They had just accused a U.S. diplomat of impersonation, laughed at her credentials, and were now facing the consequences of their monumental error. But how did this respected peace negotiator, fresh from brokering a treaty between warring nations, end up in cuffs in a first-class lounge? And what would be the fallout from this humiliating international incident? Before we carry on, please hit the subscribe button to make my day, and let me know where you are watching from in the comments. The world outside the oval window was a brilliant, searing white. A boundless kingdom of clouds that had been Renee's silent companions for the better part of 7 hours. Now, the brilliant expanse was beginning to break apart, revealing tantalizing glimpses of the world below. Long Island, a familiar patchwork of deep greens and muted grays, emerged from the vaporous sea, the first sign that her long journey was nearing its end. With a soft sigh, Renee closed the leather-bound journal resting on her lap. The ink on the last page was still fresh, her elegant script detailing the final, delicate concessions that had cinched the Geneva Peace Accord. It was done. After 3 weeks of brutal, soul-grinding negotiations, a treaty had been signed. A profound weariness, deeper than any she had felt in years, settled into her bones. It was a fatigue born not just of sleepless nights, but of navigating a tightrope of ancient grievances and modern egos, of balancing the weight of history with the fragile hope for a future. She gently massaged her temples, the rhythmic pressure a small comfort against the dull throb that had taken up residence there 48 hours ago. She thought of her late husband, David, his warm smile and the quiet wisdom in his eyes. He had been a diplomat, too, a master of the craft who had taught her that the real work, the hardest work, always began the moment you felt you had nothing left to give. "That's when your resolve is purest, Renee," he used to say, his voice a low, comforting rumble. "When you're too tired for ego." She longed for the simple, uncomplicated comfort of her own home in Georgetown, the scent of old books and lemon polish, the familiar weight of her favorite armchair, the quiet ritual of brewing a cup of Earl Grey tea in her own kitchen. She was not a person who craved luxury for its own sake. The opulent trappings of her position were merely tools. First-class travel wasn't a perk, it was a necessity, a quiet, sterile environment that allowed her to work, to think, and to arrive at her destination with the mental fortitude her job demanded. The low, reassuring hum of the Rolls-Royce engines, a sound that had been the backdrop to her thoughts for hours, began to change its pitch. The scent of freshly brewed coffee and warm pastries, a final offering from the attentive cabin crew, wafted through the air. The soft, worn leather of her seat felt like a second skin, but she was more than ready to shed it. The crisp chill of the cabin air, a constant, controlled environment, would soon be replaced by the unpredictable, chaotic energy of New York City. Disembarking from the aircraft, Renee moved with an ingrained, unhurried purpose that was often mistaken for aloofness. It was, in reality, a finely honed efficiency, a way of conserving energy for the battles that mattered. She wore a simple, elegant, dark blue pantsuit, the fabric impeccable even after the long flight, and carried a well-loved but undeniably expensive leather briefcase. It had been David's, and its familiar weight in her hand was a tangible link to him, a silent source of strength. The main concourse of the International Arrivals Terminal at John F. Kennedy Airport was a sensory assault, a cacophony of languages, the incessant chime of announcements, the rumble of rolling suitcases, and the sheer, overwhelming volume of humanity washed over her. Bright, aggressive advertising screamed from every wall, promising happiness in a bottle of perfume or a new credit card. It was a world away from the formal, restrained environments of embassies and conference halls she inhabited abroad. She bypassed the long, snaking lines for customs, her diplomatic passport granting her access to a discreet, almost hidden channel. The process was swift, anonymous, and utterly without fanfare. An officer in a glass booth glanced at her document, stamped it with a perfunctory thud, and waved her through without making eye contact. She was a ghost moving through the crowd, an observer gliding through the chaos. Usually, she found a certain peace in this anonymity, a moment of calm detachment before she was once again Ambassador Collins, a woman whose words could shift the balance of power. But today, the feeling just added to her sense of disconnection, of being utterly drained and out of place. The weariness was a physical weight, pressing down on her shoulders, and the 2-hour layover before her connecting flight to Washington, D.C. felt less like a reprieve and more like another hurdle to be cleared. The entrance to the Global Horizon first-class lounge was marked by a sleek, polished chrome desk and a velvet rope, a symbolic barrier between the weary masses and the privileged few. The decor was a study in modern, impersonal luxury. All clean lines, muted tones, and the kind of art that was chosen to offend no one and inspire nothing. It was designed to be a sanctuary, but it felt as sterile as a hospital waiting room. A young woman with a plastic headset and an air of stressed importance stood guard at the desk. Her name tag read, Brenda. Renee approached the desk, a polite, tired smile on her face. "Good afternoon," she said, her voice low and calm. "I'm on the connecting flight to Dulles. I was hoping to wait here." She presented her first-class boarding pass, the crisp paper, a testament to her right to be there. Brenda took it, her fingers brushing against Renee's. Her eyes, however, did not stay on the ticket. They flicked up, taking in Renee's simple pantsuit, lingering for a fraction of a second on her face, then darting back to the boarding pass as if searching for a discrepancy. A flicker of suspicion, subtle but unmistakable, crossed her features. "I'll just need to verify this ticket, ma'am," Brenda said. Her smile was a tight, professional rictus that didn't come close to reaching her eyes. The ma'am was clipped, a formality devoid of respect. Renee felt the first, familiar prickle of a sensation she had known her entire life. It was the subtle questioning, the unspoken challenge, the quiet dismissal. It came in 1,000 different forms, from a shopkeeper's watchful eye to a colleague's surprise at her eloquence. Usually, she could deflect it with an effortless grace, a disarming smile, or a quiet, unassailable confidence that left the other person feeling foolish. But today, her diplomatic armor was worn thin, eroded by weeks of high-stakes negotiation and a profound lack of sleep. "Of course," Renee replied, her voice even despite the flash of irritation she felt. She suppressed it immediately. This was a minor inconvenience, a bureaucratic snag, nothing more. "I've just arrived from Geneva, flight 720. She offered the information to be helpful, to smooth the process along. Brenda, however, seemed to interpret it as a challenge. She tapped at her keyboard with an exaggerated importance, her fingernails making sharp, clicking sounds against the plastic keys. "It's just that we've had a number of fraudulent passes recently," she announced, her voice a little too loud. "It's a new security directive. You understand." The last two words were delivered with a condescending tilt of her head, her tone clearly implying that Renee, a woman in a simple blue pantsuit, could not possibly understand the complex security concerns of a first-class airline lounge. The prickle of irritation intensified, sharpening into a nascent indignation. This was no longer a simple verification. It was a performance. Brenda, feeling the small, intoxicating rush of authority, was posturing. She was making a point, though of what, Renee wasn't entirely sure. Perhaps it was to impress a supervisor listening on her headset, or perhaps it was simply to assert her dominance over a traveler she had already judged and found wanting. Renee's patience, already frayed, began to unravel. She had just spent 3 weeks negotiating with warlords and foreign ministers, men whose decisions held the lives of thousands in the balance. She had done so with poise, with intellect, and with a respect that had been earned, not demanded. And now, standing in an airport in her own country, she was being treated like a potential criminal by a lounge clerk with a power complex. Before Renee could formulate a response that was both firm and dignified, Brenda made her next move. She leaned into the tiny microphone of her headset, her voice dropping into a conspiratorial, yet deliberately audible, stage whisper. "Yes, I have a possible Code 4 situation at the front desk," she murmured, her eyes darting towards Renee with a look of theatrical gravity. "Questionable credentials. The individual is not cooperating." The lie was so blatant, so utterly unnecessary, that it momentarily stunned Renee into silence. She had been nothing but cooperative. She had stood patiently, answered calmly, and waited quietly. The clerk's fabrication was a deliberate escalation, a calculated move to transform a routine check into a security incident. Brenda then turned her full attention back to Renee, her professional smile gone, replaced by a mask of cold, official resolve. Her eyes were hard, her lips a thin, determined line. She seemed to relish the moment, the power she held over this woman who stood before her, tired and unassuming. "I'm sorry," Brenda said, her voice dripping with false regret, "but I'm going to have to call airport security to sort this out." The words, sharp and accusatory, hung in the air for a moment, creating a small, tense pocket of silence around the chrome desk. Renee felt a cold knot form in the pit of her stomach. This was no longer a misunderstanding. It was a deliberate act of malice, a conscious choice to inflict humiliation. Before she could even process the full implication of the clerk's lie, two figures in dark blue uniforms were striding towards them. They moved with a practiced, heavy-footed swagger, their presence immediately altering the atmosphere of the lounge. The low hum of conversation and the clinking of glasses seemed to dip, heads turning to observe the unfolding drama. The older of the two officers, a man in his mid-50s with a face etched with the cynical boredom of a long, unremarkable career, had a name tag that read, Davies. His eyes, weary and uninterested, swept over the scene without truly seeing it. His partner was his polar opposite. He couldn't have been older than 28, with a fresh, eager face and a chest puffed out with the self-importance of his new authority. His name tag identified him as Peterson. He looked at Renee with a predatory glint in his eye, as if he had been waiting all day for an opportunity like this. Brenda, the clerk, wasted no time. She pointed a trembling accusatory finger at Renee. "Officers, thank you for coming so quickly," she said, her voice filled with a counterfeit urgency. "This individual is refusing to cooperate after presenting what I believe to be a forged entry pass." Officer Davies didn't even grant Renee the courtesy of a direct glance. He addressed Brenda as if Renee were an inanimate object, a piece of troublesome luggage to be dealt with. "Another one?" He sighed, a world of weariness in the two words. "Okay, we'll handle it." He finally turned his head a few degrees in Renee's direction. "Ma'am, I need you to step over here, away from the desk. Let's not make a scene." The quiet annoyance that had been simmering within Renee for the past 10 minutes hardened into a cold, sharp indignation. The clerk's lie was so brazen, so utterly baseless, that it defied a simple, rational response. A new steel entered her voice, replacing the tired politeness that had been there moments before. "My name is Renee Collins," she stated, her tone even and measured, each word enunciated with perfect clarity. "I am not refusing to cooperate. I have been standing here patiently, waiting for the clerk to verify my perfectly valid, fully paid-for first-class ticket." Her gaze shifted from Davies's bored face to Peterson's aggressive stance. Her mind, a finely tuned instrument of observation and analysis honed over decades of high-stakes diplomacy, began to assess the situation not as a victim, but as a strategist. She saw the older officer's profound apathy, a dangerous indifference that would allow injustice to flourish simply because it was the path of least resistance. She saw the younger officer's raw, unchecked aggression, a desperate need to assert his power and prove his worth. It was, she recognized with a chilling certainty, a volatile and dangerous combination. The curiosity of the other lounge patrons was now undisguised. A small crowd of wealthy travelers, their faces a mixture of mild amusement and detached interest, had started to gather at a safe distance, watching the spectacle unfold. Realizing that logic and patience were failing, that she was being drawn into a farcical drama scripted by a petty clerk and two biased officers, Renee made a decision. She would end this, here and now. She calmly turned to a nearby empty chair, the kind of plush, oversized seat designed for long, comfortable waits. With deliberate, unhurried movements, she placed her leather briefcase on the cushion. The two solid brass clasps clicked open with a sound that seemed unnaturally loud in the tense silence. She reached inside, her hand bypassing her journal and a folder of classified briefing notes, and retrieved a small, dark blue booklet. She turned back to the officers, holding the booklet in her hand. The Great Seal of the United States, embossed in brilliant gold, gleamed under the soft, recessed lighting of the lounge. The words "Diplomatic Passport" were printed in a clear, authoritative font above the seal. She presented it not with a flourish, but with a quiet, simple gesture, holding it out for Officer Davies to inspect. "Officers," she said, her voice still unnervingly calm, "I believe this will clarify any misunderstanding. I am a United States ambassador, returning from official government business in Geneva." For a moment, there was a flicker of uncertainty in Officer Davies's eyes. He reached for the passport, his hand hesitating for a fraction of a second. But before his fingers could touch it, Officer Peterson snatched it from Renee's grasp. He held it as if it were a piece of contaminated evidence, his lip curling into a sneer. He scoffed, a short, ugly sound of derision. "An ambassador?" he said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. He waved the passport dismissively. "Seriously? Lady, we see this all the time. People buy these things off the internet for $20. Where'd you get yours? A novelty shop in Times Square." The sneer was followed by a short, derisive laugh from Officer Davies. He shook his head, a weary, condescending smile on his face. "Give it up, sweetheart," he said, the patronizing term of endearment like a slap in the face. "The act is over. A U.S. ambassador? That's a new one. You've got guts. I'll give you that." The laughter. It was the laughter that finally broke through her formidable composure. It was not the sound of a simple mistake or a misunderstanding. It was a sound of mockery, of utter and absolute dismissal. It was a sound steeped in a prejudice so deep, so ingrained, that it rendered her identity, her accomplishments, her very reality, null and void. In their eyes, she was not a diplomat, not a person of authority, but a liar, a fraud, a joke. The dismissal was so complete, so contemptuous, that it felt like a physical blow, knocking the air from her lungs. For a fleeting, searing moment, the exhaustion and frustration of the past 3 weeks coalesced into a cold, sharp fury unlike anything she had ever experienced. The faces of the world leaders she had just been negotiating with flashed through her mind, men of immense power who had treated her with deference, with respect, with an acknowledgement of the authority she wielded. And here, in a first-class lounge in her own country, she was nothing more than a source of amusement for 2 ignorant, arrogant airport cops. The humiliation was a bitter, metallic taste in her mouth. The fury was as swift as it was intense. It burned through her, a white-hot flame that incinerated the last vestiges of her weariness. And then, just as quickly, it was gone, replaced by something far colder, far more dangerous, a glacial, analytical calm. She was no longer tired. She was focused. Officer Peterson, high on his perceived victory and emboldened by her momentary silence, took another step forward. He grabbed her arm just above the elbow, his fingers digging into her flesh. The grip was unnecessarily tight, a brutish assertion of physical dominance. Renee didn't flinch. She didn't struggle. But her entire body went rigid, her posture becoming as unyielding as granite. She turned her head slowly, her eyes locking onto his. Her voice, when she spoke, was dangerously quiet, each word a precisely cut shard of ice. "Officer," she began, "I strongly advise you to contact the State Department Diplomatic Security Service. Their number is on the back of that passport you are holding. You are making a mistake with serious international implications." Peterson's response was a smug, triumphant grin. He clearly interpreted her warning as a desperate, last-ditch bluff. "You can tell it to the judge," he sneered, his grip tightening for a moment before he began to pull her away from the desk. "You're being detained for investigation of trespassing and the use of forged documents." Officer Davies gestured with his head towards a small, glass-walled office set into the far wall of the lounge. "Let's take her to the office," he said, his voice betraying a hint of impatience. "Don't want her causing any more of a scene." They began to lead her across the lounge. It was not a long walk, perhaps 50 feet, but it was the most humiliating journey of her life. Every eye was on her. The curious onlookers were no longer trying to be discreet. They stared openly, their faces a mixture of pity, contempt, and morbid fascination. It was a perp walk, a deliberate, calculated ritual of public shaming designed to strip away her dignity and reinforce their authority. They wanted her to bow her head, to shrink into herself, to accept the role of the criminal they had assigned to her. But Renee would not give them the satisfaction. She held her head high, her back ramrod straight. Her expression was a mask of unreadable, unnerving poise. She met the gawking stares of the other travelers not with shame, but with a calm, direct gaze that made many of them look away, suddenly uncomfortable. She turned their intended spectacle of humiliation into a display of quiet, defiant grace. She was Ambassador Renee Collins. She had faced down warlords. She had stared into the eyes of tyrants. She would not be broken by the ignorance of 2 airport police officers and a petty lounge clerk. Her mind was already working, processing, planning. This incident was no longer a personal affront. It was a data point. It was a problem to be solved, and Renee Collins was, above all else, a problem solver. The office was a fishbowl, a sterile cube of glass and steel dropped into the heart of the lounge. It contained nothing more than a single, gunmetal gray desk, 2 hard plastic chairs that promised no comfort, and the harsh, unforgiving glare of fluorescent lights overhead. The walls were floor-to-ceiling glass, offering an unobstructed view of the curious faces that now stared in at her. She was an exhibit, a specimen on display for the entertainment of the privileged. The officers, Davies and Peterson, had placed her inside and shut the door with a definitive click, taking up guard positions just outside, their arms crossed. Their expressions a mixture of smug satisfaction and bored impatience. Renee did not sit. To sit would be to accept their terms, to fold into the role of the defeated detainee. Instead, She walked to the center of the small room and stood, her posture as perfect and unyielding as it had been in the grandest of negotiating halls. She looked out through the glass, her gaze sweeping over the onlookers. She met their eyes, one by one, not with the shame or fear they expected, but with a calm, assessing gaze that was far more unsettling. She was not the object of their scrutiny. She was the observer, and under her quiet, intelligent stare, many of them shifted uncomfortably and looked away. The white-hot fury that had seared through her moments before had receded, extinguished by a lifetime of discipline. In its place was a cold, crystalline focus, the analytical mindset that had made her one of the most effective diplomats of her generation. This was no longer a personal affront, a random act of prejudice that had unfortunately ensnared her. It was a data point. It was a systemic failure, a critical flaw in a system she had sworn to represent. Her mind, trained in the intricate arts of negotiation and strategy, began to deconstruct the event with a chilling detachment. She saw the clerk, Brenda, a young woman whose own insecurities and desperate need for authority had led her to fabricate a lie. She saw the officers, Davies and Peterson, their implicit biases so deeply ingrained that they were utterly blind to the reality in front of them, their training so woefully inadequate that it had failed to account for the possibility of a black woman holding a position of immense power. She thought of the young attachés and junior diplomats of color she mentored, bright, ambitious young people who were just beginning their careers in the State Department. She had always told them that their greatest assets were their intellect, their integrity, and their unwavering belief in the ideals of their country. What would she tell them now? That those ideals were a fragile shield, easily shattered by the casual bigotry of an airport security guard. The humiliation she felt was real, a dull, persistent ache beneath her ribs, but she compartmentalized it, locking it away in a mental vault. Her personal feelings were a luxury she could not afford right now. They were secondary to the professional and systemic implications of this incident. This was not a moment for emotion. It was a moment for documentation, for analysis, and for rectification. The muffled clinking of glasses and the low murmur of conversation from the lounge filtered through the glass, a soundtrack to her isolation. She could see her own reflection superimposed over the curious faces staring in, a ghostly image of a woman in a simple blue pantsuit, a woman who held the power to broker peace between nations but could not convince two police officers of her own identity. The air in the small room was stale, thick with the faint, unpleasant smell of old coffee and industrial cleaning solution. Her attention was drawn back to the two officers standing guard outside her glass prison. They were laughing, sharing a joke as Peterson spoke into his radio. He was running her name, she realized, through the standard NYPD and Port Authority databases. The entire process was a performance of due diligence, a box-ticking exercise to justify the conclusion they had already reached. Renee could hear Peterson's voice, distorted but still audible through the glass. Yeah, Collins, Renee, Collins. No local priors. Dispatcher says the record's clean. Probably just a nutcase with a story. He paused, listening to the response on his radio, then chuckled. You're not going to believe this. She claimed she was an ambassador, had the whole fake passport and everything. Looked pretty real, too. These online shops are getting good. Davies shook his head, a weary smirk on his face. Doesn't matter. Just run it for warrants and we'll transport her to the precinct for processing. Let the detectives figure it out. I'm not paid enough to deal with this kind of crazy. The conversation, so casual, so dismissive, confirmed every part of her cold analysis. They were not looking for the truth. They were looking for confirmation of their initial assumption. They were following a script that existed only in their heads, a narrative where a black woman in a pantsuit could only be a troublemaker or a lunatic. Every action she had taken, every word she had spoken, had been interpreted as a piece of evidence to support that script. Her calm was arrogance. Her credentials were a novelty. Her quiet, firm warning was a threat. They were not engaged in an investigation. They were engaged in an act of confirmation bias, their minds as closed and locked as the door to her glass cell. She felt a sudden, powerful urge to use her one phone call, to dial the emergency number for the Diplomatic Security Service. She could picture the response, the immediate, overwhelming force that would be brought to bear. Calls would be made, alarms would be raised, and the full weight of the United States government would descend upon this airport with the force of a thunderbolt. The thought brought a fleeting, grim satisfaction. But she dismissed it just as quickly. That would be an emotional reaction, a cry for help. Her response had to be strategic. It had to be more powerful than a simple rescue. She would not give them the satisfaction of seeing her break. She would not give them the easy out of a superior officer telling them they had made a mistake. She would let their system, the one they believed in so fervently, fail completely, utterly, and publicly on its own terms. She made a conscious decision. She would wait. She would let them complete their process. She would let them dig their own graves. Unseen by Renee, in a quiet corner of the lounge, far from the spectacle at the security office, a man sat watching the scene with a growing sense of alarm. His name was Arthur Harrison, a man in his late 60s with a mane of silver hair and a face that spoke of a life lived in boardrooms and exclusive clubs. He was dressed in a tailored Savile Row suit that probably cost more than Officer Peterson's monthly salary. For the past 40 years, Mr. Harrison had worked in the world of international finance, structuring deals and navigating the complex political landscapes of developing nations. He had seen his fair share of diplomatic passports, had his own luggage inspected by grim-faced security details in a dozen different countries, and knew the look of authentic authority when he saw it. He had witnessed the entire exchange, from the moment the calm, tired-looking woman had approached the desk to the moment the two oafish officers had laughed in her face. He had seen the passport she presented. He had been too far away to read the name, but he had recognized the deep blue cover, the distinctive gold seal, and, most importantly, the woman's bearing as she presented it. It was not the act of a fraud. It was the quiet, confident gesture of someone for whom such documents were a simple fact of life. He had also recognized the dangerous, swaggering ignorance of the two officers. He had seen men like them before, petty tyrants given a sliver of power and a license to abuse it. He knew that this situation was a powder keg, and the officers were gleefully dancing on it with lit matches. Troubled, he discreetly pulled his phone from his jacket pocket. He scrolled through his contacts, his thumb hovering for a moment over a name simply listed as John D.C. He hesitated. John hated being bothered with trivialities, but this, Harrison knew, was anything but trivial. He pressed the call button. The call was answered on the second ring. Harrison, a gruff voice on the other end, said, skipping any pleasantries. "John, sorry to bother you on a Friday afternoon," Harrison began, his voice low and urgent, his hand cupped around the phone to prevent being overheard. "I'm at JFK, in the Global Horizon Lounge. There's a situation here, and it's about to get very, very ugly." There was a pause on the other end. "What kind of situation?" "The Port Authority police are detaining a black woman," Harrison said, choosing his words carefully. "They're treating her like a common criminal. The thing is, John, she presented a diplomatic passport. I saw it. It looked absolutely genuine." Another pause, this one longer, more charged. "Are you sure?" "I've seen enough of them to know," Harrison affirmed. They laughed at her. They literally laughed in her face and accused her of buying it online. "Her name is Renee Collins. I heard one of the officers say it on his radio. I don't know her personally, but I know this is going to explode if someone competent doesn't intervene. And fast. The officers are about to transport her to a local precinct. They're completely oblivious. They think she's a nutcase." The silence on the other end of the line was now heavy with unspoken implications. Harrison could almost hear the gears turning in his friend's powerful mind. John was a senior official at the National Security Council, a man who understood the delicate architecture of international relations and the catastrophic damage that could be caused by a single, stupid mistake. "Stay where you are, Arthur." John's voice finally came back, no longer gruff, but sharp, cold, and utterly focused. "Do not get involved directly, but keep your eyes on her. I'm making a call. Someone will be there in minutes." The line went dead. Mr. Harrison slipped his phone back into his pocket. He took a slow sip of his scotch, his eyes fixed on the glass box across the lounge. He felt a grim satisfaction. The action, unknown to the woman in the box and her two tormentors, had started a chain reaction, a cascade of phone calls and urgent commands that was now rocketing through the highest levels of the federal government. It was not the ambassador pulling rank. It was an informed citizen recognizing a serious, dangerous breach of protocol and acting responsibly. The system, so blind and broken at its lowest levels, was about to receive a jolt from the very top. The curtain was about to rise on a whole new act of this sordid little play. The casual, self-satisfied laughter between the two officers abruptly died. A sharp burst of static erupted from the radio on Officer Davies' shoulder, followed by a voice that bore no resemblance to the jovial dispatcher they had been joking with moments before. This voice was tight, high-pitched, and strained with a panic so palpable it seemed to crackle through the speaker. "Unit 7 to 3, this is dispatch. Priority 1 channel." The voice squawked, the words tumbling over each other in their urgency. "Acknowledge immediately." Davies, his smirk instantly vanishing, fumbled for the radio. Dispatch, this is 7 to 3, go ahead." "Hold your position at the Global Horizon Lounge," the dispatcher commanded. the voice now sharp as broken glass. Do not, repeat, do not transport the detainee. I say again, do not transport. A federal agent is en route to your location, ETA less than 5 minutes. You are to stand by and await his arrival. Acknowledge. The blood drained from Officer Davies's face, leaving behind a pasty grey pallor. He looked at Peterson, his eyes wide with a confusion that was rapidly curdling into fear. A federal agent? For a routine detention of a crackpot with a fake passport? It made no sense. Dispatch, roger that, Davies stammered into the radio, his voice suddenly hoarse. 7-3 holding position, awaiting federal agent. He lowered the radio, his hand trembling slightly. The smug certainty that had animated him just moments ago had evaporated, replaced by a cold, creeping dread. He and Peterson exchanged a look of pure, unadulterated panic. What the hell was that? Peterson whispered, his voice a choked rasp. The puffed-up bravado was gone, his shoulders slumped, his face a mask of disbelief. Federal agent? What's the Fed's interest in this? I don't know, Davies hissed back, his eyes darting nervously towards the glass box where Renee sat. Just stay put. Don't say anything else. Don't do anything. Inside the office, Renee had finally taken a seat. She had watched the entire exchange, observing the officers' transformation with a detached, clinical interest. She saw their smug confidence shatter, saw the confusion bloom in their eyes, followed by the unmistakable pallor of fear. It was exactly as she had anticipated. The system, having failed at its lowest level, was now beginning to correct itself, and the correction was coming with a velocity that was both violent and deeply satisfying. She felt no triumph, no surge of vindictive pleasure. Instead, she felt a grim validation. Her decision to wait, to let the protocol play out to its inevitable disastrous conclusion for the 2 men outside her door, had been the correct one. This was no longer about her, it was about the flaw in the machine, and the machine itself was now screaming in alarm. The atmosphere in the first-class lounge had shifted from one of morbid curiosity to a thick, anxious tension. The onlookers, sensing that the drama had escalated into something far more serious, fell silent. The low murmur of conversation ceased. The clinking of glasses stopped. All eyes were fixed on the 2 police officers who now stood stiffly outside the glass office, their faces ashen, their bodies rigid with a new, unfamiliar apprehension. The arrival, when it came, was not loud or dramatic. It was a study in silent, focused intensity. A path parted through the crowd of onlookers as if by an invisible force. At the head of this human wake was a man who moved with an incredible, almost preternatural speed and purpose. He was of average height and build, dressed in a simple, dark grey suit that was so perfectly tailored it seemed a part of him. He was not physically imposing, yet he radiated an aura of absolute, unquestionable authority. His face was a mask of grim determination, his eyes like chips of ice. Flanking him, struggling to keep up, was another man in a rumpled suit, his face slick with sweat, his eyes wide with panic. Renee recognized him from airport orientation briefings as Jim O'Connell, the Port Authority's head of security for the entire airport. The 2 men did not slow their pace until they were standing directly in front of the 2 dumbstruck officers. The man in the grey suit, whose name Renee did not yet know, but whose function she understood with perfect clarity, let his icy gaze sweep over Davies and Peterson. A look of such profound contempt that both officers seemed to shrink inside their uniforms. His eyes then flickered to Renee, who was now standing inside the glass office. For a fraction of a second, a look of deep concern, almost apology, crossed his features. Then, his gaze snapped back to the 2 officers, his expression once again hardening into a mask of cold fury. His voice, when he spoke, was low, almost a whisper, yet it cut through the dead silence of the lounge like a surgeon's scalpel. Identify yourselves. Officer Davies, his throat suddenly dry, swallowed hard. Officer Davies, Port Authority Police, he stammered, his voice barely audible. This is Officer Peterson. Sir, we were just responding to a call from the lounge staff regarding a possible forged document. The man in the grey suit held up a hand, a short, sharp gesture that instantly silenced Davies. He ignored the pathetic, half-formed explanation completely. He was not there to listen to excuses. He was there to contain a disaster. Give me the passport, he commanded, his voice leaving no room for argument or delay. He held out his hand. Then, his eyes still locked on Davies, he jerked his chin towards the glass door and unlocked that door, now. The airport security chief, O'Connell, was wringing his hands, his face a mess of frantic apology. Sir, Ambassador, we had no idea, he babbled, his words directed at the glass, at the federal agent, at anyone who might listen. "This is an unacceptable breakdown in protocol. These officers—" The agent ignored him as if he were a fly buzzing in the room. His entire focus was on the two disgraced officers. Peterson, his hands now trembling so violently he could barely function, fumbled at his belt for the keys. His fingers seemed to be made of rubber. He dropped the keys, the metallic clatter echoing in the cavernous silence. With a choked sob of frustration, he snatched them up and finally managed to fit the key into the lock. The sound of the bolt turning was like a gunshot in the silent lounge. The agent, whose name was Coulson, pushed the door open and stepped inside, leaving O'Connell and the two officers standing outside in the metaphorical cold. He walked directly to Renee, his steps sure and confident. He stopped a respectful 2 feet in front of her. She stood to meet him, her posture erect, her expression calm and unreadable. Agent Coulson reached out and took the diplomatic passport from Officer Peterson's nerveless fingers, handling it not like a piece of evidence, but with the reverence one might afford a holy relic. He gave it a cursory glance, not to verify its authenticity, which he already knew, but as a gesture of respect for the document itself. Then, he did something that sent a collective shockwave through the entire room. He tucked the passport carefully into his inside jacket pocket, brought his heels together with a sharp, audible click, and snapped his entire body to rigid attention. He raised his right hand in a perfect formal salute, his fingers straight, his thumb tucked, the edge of his hand touching the corner of his right eyebrow. The gesture was so unexpected, so profound in its implications, that it seemed to suck the very air from the room. It was a salute, not to a person, but to an office, to a symbol of the nation itself. It was an act of deference so absolute that it instantly and irrevocably shattered the narrative the officers had constructed. "Ambassador Collins," Agent Coulson said, his voice clear, formal, and ringing with an authority that dwarfed that of the two local cops. "On behalf of the United States government, I offer our most profound and sincere apologies for this unacceptable incident. My name is Special Agent Mark Coulson, Diplomatic Security Service. Are you unharmed?" Renee did not return the salute. That was not the protocol. Instead, she gave a slight, formal nod of her head, an acknowledgement from one professional to another. Her voice, when she spoke, was steady and clear, carrying easily through the silent room to the horrified audience outside. "I am physically unharmed, Agent Coulson," she said, her gaze unwavering. "But I am deeply, deeply concerned." The words hung in the air, a quiet indictment that was more powerful than any shout. Outside the office, the last vestiges of color drained from Officer Peterson's face. He looked as if he were about to be physically sick. Officer Davies stared, his mouth agape, his mind finally, belatedly, grasping the sheer, cataclysmic scale of the mistake he had just made. He had not just detained a citizen, he had detained a piece of the government itself. At the front desk, Brenda, the clerk who had started it all, had a hand clamped over her mouth, her eyes wide, with a terror so pure it was almost childlike. The power dynamic had not just shifted, it had been inverted, shattered, and ground into dust. The consequences of their ignorance and prejudice were just beginning to rain down upon them, and they all knew, with a sudden gut-wrenching certainty, that this was a storm from which there would be no shelter. Agent Coulson lowered his hand from the salute, his posture remaining ramrod straight. He gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod, acknowledging the profound weight of her words. "Your concern is justified, Ambassador," he said, his voice a low, steady anchor in the swirling chaos. He turned his head, his icy gaze falling upon the airport security chief Jim O'Connell, who was hovering by the door, his face a ghastly shade of white. "Mr. O'Connell, you will find Ambassador Collins a secure, private room, immediately, the most comfortable one you have. And you will ensure a pot of fresh Earl Grey tea and a bottle of still water are brought to her without delay." O'Connell, jolted into action, began sputtering. "Yes, of course, right away, Agent Coulson. Our VIP suite, it's just down the hall, it's soundproof, completely private." He gestured frantically to a subordinate who scurried away. Coulson turned back to Renee, his expression softening almost imperceptibly. "Ambassador, if you'll come with me." He gestured for her to precede him out of the glass office. As she stepped out, the crowd of onlookers, who had been held in a state of suspended animation, seemed to collectively exhale. A wave of whispers rippled through the lounge. Renee ignored them all. Her focus was singular, her mind already several steps ahead, formulating a strategy. She walked beside Agent Coulson, a silent, powerful alliance forming between them with every step. O'Connell trotted behind them like a panicked courtier. His apologies a continuous, desperate murmur. The suite was as opulent as O'Connell had promised. A hushed sanctuary of plush, cream-colored sofas, dark wood paneling, and a floor-to-ceiling window that offered a panoramic view of the tarmac, where massive jets took off and landed with a silent, majestic grace. The contrast between the serene luxury of the room and the ugly, degrading incident that had just occurred was jarring. A moment later, a staff member arrived, her hands trembling as she set down a silver tray bearing a steaming teapot, a delicate china cup, and a crystal glass of water. O'Connell shut the door, sealing the three of them inside. He immediately resumed his frantic damage control, his words tumbling out in a desperate torrent. "Ambassador Collins, I cannot express how profoundly sorry I am. This is, without question, the single worst failure of protocol I have witnessed in my 15 years at this airport. The officers involved have been suspended, effective immediately. Their police powers have been revoked pending a full and thorough investigation, which I will personally oversee. The clerk from the front desk has already been terminated. Her access to the airport has been permanently revoked." He paused, taking a ragged breath, his eyes pleading with her. "We will do whatever it takes to make this right. Whatever you need. We can arrange a private jet to take you to your final destination, of course. No need to deal with another commercial flight. And we would like to offer a significant compensation for the distress, the humiliation. Name a figure, any figure. It's yours." Renee had been calmly pouring her tea, her hands perfectly steady. She added a splash of milk, stirred it slowly, and took a small, deliberate sip. She let the silence stretch, allowing O'Connell's desperate offers to hang in the air, exposing them for the hollow, inadequate gestures they were. She placed the cup back on its saucer with a soft click. Finally, she looked at him, her gaze clear and direct. She held up a hand, a gentle but firm gesture that instantly cut off the flow of his apologies. "Mr. O'Connell," she began, her voice devoid of anger but filled with an unshakable authority. "This is not about punishing a few individuals. This is not about a private jet or a monetary settlement. Do you understand that?" O'Connell, flustered, could only nod dumbly. "This is about a systemic rot," Renee continued, her words precise and cutting. "Your officers and your staff were not trained to recognize a United States ambassador who looks like me. They were not trained to verify a diplomatic passport. Instead, they saw a black woman, and they jumped to a conclusion so deeply rooted in their prejudice that their training, what little they may have had, did not equip them to question it. They did not see a diplomat. They saw a threat, a fraud, a problem to be managed. This is not a customer service issue, Mr. O'Connell. It is a national security failure." Agent Coulson, who had been standing silently by the window, spoke for the first time since entering the room. "The ambassador is correct," he stated, his voice flat and final. "The Vienna Convention on Diplomatic Relations is not a suggestion. It is international law. Those officers illegally detained a protected official of the United States government. The potential diplomatic fallout, if this had been a foreign official, say the French or British ambassador, is catastrophic. An incident like this could spark an international crisis. We are, frankly, lucky this happened to one of our own, someone who understands the stakes." O'Connell's face, if possible, grew even paler. The words international crisis and national security failure had finally pierced his bubble of managerial panic, revealing the terrifying abyss that had opened up beneath his feet. He had been thinking about a lawsuit, about bad press. He now understood that he was facing a problem of a completely different magnitude. From the corner of her eye, through the vast window of the suite, Renee caught a glimpse of movement on the lounge floor below. She stood and walked to the window, her teacup in hand. Two senior Port Authority officers, their faces grim and set like stone, were escorting Davies and Peterson away. They were not in handcuffs, but they had been stripped of their sidearms, their radios, and their authority. Their duty belts were conspicuously empty. They walked with their heads down, their shoulders slumped in defeat, their faces gray with the shock and shame of their sudden public downfall. They avoided looking at anyone, their gazes fixed on the floor in front of them. In the background, near the front desk, she saw Brenda, the clerk, being led away by a woman in a business suit who could only be from human resources. Brenda was sobbing quietly, her face buried in her hands, her brief, intoxicating reign of power having ended in utter ruin. Renee watched them go, and the strangest thing happened. She felt nothing. There was no triumph, no satisfaction, no gratifying sense of vengeance. There was only a profound and overwhelming sense of waste. Their careers were over. Their lives, and the lives of their families, had been irrevocably upended. And for what? For an ignorance that had been allowed to fester, for a prejudice that had never been challenged, for a systemic failure that had set them up to fail. Their downfall brought her no joy. It only reinforced her conviction, hardening it from a belief into an absolute certainty. Punishment was not the answer. Punishment was a temporary, unsatisfying fix. The only real lasting solution was education. She turned away from the window, her resolve solidifying into a concrete plan of action. She had their attention. She had their fear. Now, she would have their compliance. She walked back to the sofa and sat down, placing her teacup on the table with a newfound sense of purpose. She looked from O'Connell's terrified face to Coulson's grimly professional one. The time for analyzing the problem was over. It was time to dictate the solution. "I do not want a private jet, Mr. O'Connell," she said, her voice ringing with the clear, indisputable authority of her office. "I do not want your money. I want a meeting." O'Connell stared at her, his mind struggling to process the sudden shift. "A meeting?" he repeated, stunned. "Of course, Ambassador. Whatever you need. Who do you want to meet with? I'll have them here in an hour." Renee gave a small, humorless smile. "It will take more than an hour to assemble this group," she said. "I want you in that room, Mr. O'Connell. I want Agent Coulson, or his superior from the Diplomatic Security Service. I want the regional head of the Transportation Security Administration, and I want a senior representative from the Department of Homeland Security, someone with direct oversight of Customs and Border Protection training protocols. I will be there, and we will have a conversation." O'Connell was speechless. This was no longer a request. It was a directive from a senior government official who was now, for all intents and purposes, his superior. "We are going to talk about training," Renee declared, her eyes boring into his. "We are going to develop, and we are going to implement, a mandatory cultural competency and implicit bias program for every single law enforcement officer, federal agent, and private security contractor who operates in our nation's airports and at our borders. We will create a new, standardized protocol for the verification of diplomatic credentials that does not rely on the uninformed judgment of a frontline employee. This incident was a symptom, Mr. O'Connell. I am interested in curing the disease." She leaned back, her gaze sweeping between the two men. "Is that understood?" Agent Coulson gave a single, decisive nod. "Perfectly, Ambassador. I will make the calls myself. You will have your meeting." O'Connell, finally grasping the new reality, could only stammer, "Yes, Ambassador. Yes, of course. It will be done." In that moment, the transformation was complete. Renee Collins was no longer a victim of a humiliating injustice. She was no longer a detainee in a glass box. She had taken the ugliness of the past hour, the prejudice, the ignorance, the humiliation, and she had forged it into a tool of power. She had transformed her personal degradation into the leverage she needed to force systemic reform. She had demonstrated, with a quiet and terrifying grace, where her true power lay, not in the title of ambassador or the privileges of her passport, but in her unyielding will and her profound ability to use her position to effect meaningful, lasting change. The battle in the lounge was over, but she had just declared a new war, a war against the ignorance that threatened the very fabric of the nation she so proudly served. And it was a war she was determined to win. 3 weeks later, the air in the conference room on the 7th floor of the J. Edgar Hoover building was thick with the scent of old wood, lemon polish, and the immense, unspoken weight of power. The room was a fortress of tradition, its walls paneled in dark, gleaming mahogany that had absorbed the secrets of decades. A long, imposing table, polished to a mirror shine, reflected the grim, serious faces of the men seated around it. These were the architects and guardians of national security, a collection of senior officials whose decisions rippled across the globe. At the far end sat the National Security Advisor, a formidable man with a shock of silver hair and eyes that had seen the rise and fall of governments. Beside him, the administrator of the TSA shifted uncomfortably in his chair, his expression a tight mask of defensiveness. Several other senior figures from Homeland Security and the Justice Department were present, their postures rigid, their faces impassive. They had been summoned to this meeting, and they had come expecting to perform damage control, to placate a VIP with a grievance. At the head of the table, in the seat typically reserved for the director, sat Ambassador Renee Collins. She was dressed in a sharp, authoritative charcoal gray suit, her bearing as commanding as anyone in the room. Beside her, a quiet and watchful presence, was Agent Coulson. Renee was not there to recount her story with emotion or to solicit apologies. She was there to deliver a security briefing. She had arranged the files in front of her not as a victim presenting evidence, but as an expert presenting a case study. She began to speak, her voice calm, measured, and devoid of any trace of personal grievance. "Gentlemen," she started, her eyes sweeping across the room, making contact with each man. "I have not requested this meeting to discuss the personal humiliation I experienced at John F. Kennedy Airport 3 weeks ago. I am here to discuss a critical failure in our national security protocol, a vulnerability that this incident has exposed." A subtle shift occurred in the room. The officials, who had been bracing for an emotional tirade, found themselves listening to the cool, analytical language of their own profession. Renee clicked a pen and gestured to the first file. "The incident, as I will refer to it, can be broken down into multiple failure points," she continued. Failure point 1. A civilian contractor, an airline lounge employee, was empowered to make a security judgment she was not qualified to make, based on nothing more than her own personal bias. Failure point 2. The responding law enforcement officers were unable to distinguish a legitimate United States diplomatic passport from a forgery. Worse, they chose to dismiss it out of hand, not because of any technical flaw in the document, but because of the perceived identity of the person holding it. She paused, letting the weight of her words settle in the silent room. When an officer in a primary international port of entry, a gateway to our nation, makes a security determination based on prejudice, that is not a human resources issue. That is a security breach. It creates a vulnerability that our adversaries, who do not look like me but are far more dangerous, could potentially exploit. We spend billions of dollars securing our borders from external, tangible threats. We must also secure them from the internal, intangible threat of ignorance. She saw their expressions changing. The defensiveness was slowly being replaced by a dawning comprehension, a flicker of genuine concern. They were no longer looking at a disgruntled diplomat. They were seeing a colleague, a fellow professional, identifying a flaw in the system they were all sworn to protect. "We train our diplomats, our intelligence officers, and our soldiers to navigate the complex and often hostile cultural landscapes of foreign nations," Renee concluded, her voice ringing with a quiet, unshakable conviction. "It is time we ensure our own federal and local officers can navigate the diverse cultural landscape of the nation they are sworn to protect. This is not a matter of political correctness. It is a matter of operational readiness and national security." She finished speaking and a profound silence filled the room. The National Security Advisor, who had been listening with a deep, unbroken concentration, leaned forward, his hands clasped on the polished table. He looked at the TSA administrator, then at the other officials, and finally, his gaze settled on Renee. A slow, deliberate nod was his first response. He was clearly, deeply impressed. "The ambassador is right," he said, his voice a low, authoritative rumble that commanded the full attention of everyone present. "This was not a simple mistake. This was a systemic failure, and we were lucky it was Ambassador Collins who exposed it and not one of our enemies." He turned to the TSA administrator, his expression leaving no room for debate. "You will work with the Diplomatic Security Service and the other relevant agencies. You will develop a new, mandatory training protocol. It will cover cultural competency, implicit bias, and, most importantly, the strict, non-negotiable protocols for handling and verifying diplomatic credentials. This will be implemented nationwide, at every level of airport and border security. There will be no exceptions." The TSA administrator, his face now flushed with a mixture of embarrassment and newfound purpose, nodded vigorously. "Yes, sir. We will begin immediately." The National Security Advisor leaned back in his chair, a thoughtful expression on his face. He looked at Renee, a hint of a respectful smile touching his lips. "This new training protocol," he mused, "this new directive, I think it only fitting that we call it the Collins Initiative." The name hung in the air, a testament to her victory. It was not a legacy of victimhood, but one of proactive, powerful, and positive change. Renee felt a quiet surge of satisfaction, not for the personal honor, but for the weight and permanence the name would give to the work ahead. She simply nodded, a gesture of acceptance and understanding. The real work, as David had always said, was just beginning. 6 months later, Renee found herself in another airport, another first-class lounge. It could have been Chicago or Dallas or Los Angeles. The details were unimportant. The decor was the same blend of beige and chrome, the air filled with the same low hum of quiet travel. She was on her way to another assignment, another negotiation in a far-flung corner of the world. She approached the check-in desk, her briefcase in hand, a familiar sense of weariness just beginning to settle in her shoulders. A young man stood behind the desk. He was sharp, professional, and his name tag read David. He was a person of color, and he greeted her with a warm, genuine smile. "Good afternoon," he said. "May I see your boarding pass, please?" Renee handed him her pass and her passport. He took them, his movements efficient and sure. He scanned the boarding pass, then opened the passport. His eyes didn't flicker with suspicion. He didn't glance from the photo to her face with a questioning look. He simply read the name, processed the information, and looked back up at her, his smile widening slightly. "Welcome, Ambassador Collins," he said, his voice filled with a simple, unaffected respect. "We have a quiet seat for you by the window. It's ready for you whenever you are. May I bring you a cup of tea, perhaps an Earl Grey?" A small, genuine smile touched Renee's lips, the first she had felt in what seemed like a very long time. The interaction was seamless, respectful, and so utterly, beautifully normal. It was the normality that felt like the greatest victory of all. There was no friction, no challenge, no subtle test she had to pass. She was simply a traveler, a diplomat, being treated with the courtesy and professionalism her status and her humanity demanded. "Thank you, David," she replied, her voice soft. "That would be lovely." She walked to her seat by the window and sat down. A few moments later, the tea arrived, steaming and fragrant in a delicate china cup. She held it in her hands, the warmth seeping into her fingers. She looked out the window at the endless ballet of planes taking off and landing, each one a vessel of stories, of departures and arrivals. The incident 6 months ago had been ugly, degrading, and deeply painful. It had left a scar, but the outcomes, this quiet moment of peace, this simple act of respectful service, was more meaningful than any apology or compensation. The system wasn't perfect. It would never be perfect. But she had forced it to be better. She had taken her humiliation and used it as a lever to move the world. Just a little. And for a diplomat, for a woman who had dedicated her life to the quiet, patient work of building a better world, that was a victory more profound and more satisfying than any treaty she had ever signed.